It was supposed to be a routine drive, nothing extraordinary. I was heading home from a late-night shift, the clock on the dashboard reading 11:47 p.m. The route through the mountain pass had always been eerily quiet at night, but I had done it countless times before. Familiarity, I thought, would dull any sense of unease. I couldn't have been more wrong. The road began winding through the dense forest as the incline grew steeper. My car's headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing little more than the snaking asphalt ahead and trees that seemed to press in closer with each passing mile. There were no other cars in sight, which was expected, but something about the silence felt heavier. It was a suffocating sort of quiet, broken only by the hum of my engine and the rhythmic crunch of gravel whenever my tires strayed too close to the shoulder. The radio, which I had turned on for some company, hissed static no matter which station I tried. Eventually I gave up and switched it off, resigned to the oppressive solitude of the mountain road. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 30 feet ahead, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of my headlights. She was standing just off the road, her silhouette partially obscured by the trees. A woman dressed in what looked like a pale gown, long and flowing. My stomach dropped. I instinctively slowed down, unsure of what to do. Was she hurt? Lost? My mind raced as I inched closer. She didn't move. As my car crept nearer, her features became clearer. Pale skin, hair so black it seemed to swallow the light, and eyes that were completely devoid of color, like two dark pits staring right into me. I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, and for a moment, everything was still. My headlights bathed her in an unnatural glow, and I swear I saw her mouth move. No sound came out, but I could feel the words, feel them sinking into my chest like ice. "Help me," her lips seemed to say. Something deep inside me screamed to drive away, but my body betrayed me. Against every instinct, I rolled down the window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" My voice sounded foreign, shaky. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer, and that's when I noticed. Her feet weren't touching the ground. Panic surged through me. I threw the car into reverse, but before I could press the gas, she vanished. Just like that. One blink, and she was gone. I sat there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Then came the knock, a single sharp tap against the driver's side window. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. She was there, her face inches from the glass. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of teeth that were far too sharp, far too many. The car's engine sputtered and died. I didn't even try to restart it. I was too petrified to move. Her hand pressed against the window, and for a horrifying moment, I thought she was going to shatter it. But instead, she whispered something, her voice low and raspy. "You'll never leave." The lights flickered, and then everything went dark. The world outside the car dissolved into blackness, and for a moment, it felt like I was floating in some vast, empty void. When the headlights blinked back on, the road ahead was gone. In its place was a thick fog, impenetrable and suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The woman was nowhere to be seen, but the sense of her presence lingered. It was as if the air itself had become heavier, pressing down on me with an almost physical force. Desperate, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine groaned but refused to start. I tried again, and again. On the third attempt, it roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as I plunged into the fog. The road twisted and turned, more sharply than I remembered. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the windshield. The fog was relentless, swallowing everything around me, and the faint outline of trees seemed to pulse and shift like living things. Then I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, her arms outstretched. I swerved hard, narrowly avoiding her, and the car skidded to a stop. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, but before I could even think about reversing, the car began to move on its own. The steering wheel jerked violently, dragging me down a side road I hadn't noticed before. I fought against it, but it was like the car had a mind of its own. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in until their branches scraped against the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers. And then I saw it. A house. It loomed out of the fog, old and decrepit, its windows glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. The car stopped abruptly in front of it, and the engine cut out. I sat there, paralyzed, as the front door creaked open. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, beckoning. It wasn't the woman. It was something else, something far more sinister. Its shape shifted and twisted, never quite settling, and its eyes burned with an unnatural light. The air inside the car grew icy, frost creeping across the windows. My breath came in short, visible puffs as I fumbled with the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. I pounded on the glass, screaming, but no sound escaped my lips. And then it was there, right outside the car, staring at me with those burning eyes. It raised a hand and pressed it against the windshield. The glass cracked beneath its touch, spiderwebbing outward in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The last thing I remember before everything went black was its voice, low and guttural, whispering in my ear, "You belong to me now." I've never shared this with anyone before. Even now, my hands tremble as I type. It's not the kind of story you want to remember, let alone retell. But maybe writing it down will help me move on, though I'm not sure I'll ever truly forget. It happened 5 years ago. I was driving home from a friend's wedding late at night. The wedding had been in a town about 3 hours away, and the fastest route back home cut through a mountainous pass. I didn't think twice about taking it. After all, I'd driven that road before. But something about that night felt different, though I brushed it off as exhaustion. The night was dark, unusually so. My headlights barely pierced the inky blackness, and the tall pines lining the road seemed to crowd in, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. There was no moonlight, no stars, just an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything. Even the familiar hum of my car felt unnerving, too loud against the silence outside. It was just past 2 a.m. when I saw him. The figure appeared suddenly on the side of the road, illuminated in the faint glow of my headlights. A man, standing perfectly still, his thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. His clothes caught my attention first. A black suit, spotless and pressed, like he was on his way to a funeral or a business meeting. Then I saw his face, or rather, his grin. Even from a distance, I could see it. A smile stretched so wide it seemed to defy the natural limits of the human face. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of grin that made your stomach twist with unease. My first instinct was to drive past him. Who picks up a stranger in the middle of nowhere at this hour? But as my car neared, something strange happened. My hands turned the wheel, almost involuntarily, and I found myself slowing down. A voice in my head, soft but insistent, whispered, "Stop." Before I knew it, I had rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. Then, without a word, he opened the passenger door and slid in. The car seemed to shudder as he did, and I felt the temperature drop instantly. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting perfectly upright, his hands resting on his knees, his grin still fixed in place. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just ahead," he replied. I turned to confront him, ready to demand answers, but the passenger seat was empty. He was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there he was, sitting in the back seat, his grin now impossibly wide, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Keep driving," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "We're not there yet." I didn't argue. I pressed the gas pedal and sped down the road, my hands trembling on the wheel. The whispers on the radio grew louder, and the trees outside seemed to close in, their branches scraping against the car like fingers. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the darkness, twisted, hollow-eyed faces staring back at me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The radio went silent, the air grew warm again, and the road ahead was clear. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him still sitting there, but the back seat was empty. I pulled over, my body shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how long I sat there trying to catch my breath. When I finally mustered the courage to step out of the car, I looked back down the road, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no disturbance. It was like he'd never been there. But when I got back in the car, I noticed something. On the passenger seat, there was a single black feather, glistening faintly in the dim light. I don't know what it meant, and I don't want to know. I just drove home as fast as I could, swearing to myself that I'd never take that road again, and I haven't. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my room, I hear that melody, faint, distant, but unmistakable, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his next ride. It was late, too late to be driving through the Ridge Pass. I knew it, but I had no choice. The promotion at work had come with more responsibilities than I'd anticipated, and staying late at the office had become routine. By the time I got on the road that night, the clock was ticking past 11 p.m. Ridge Pass was infamous. Locals whispered about strange happenings, accidents, and disappearances. A lonely stretch of road that snaked through the mountains. It was surrounded by dense forests on either side. The trees leaned in, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight, casting the road in an eerie half-darkness. I turned up the radio to drown out my unease, but even the cheerful chatter of the late-night DJ couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The air felt heavier, the headlights seemed dimmer, and the road stretched endlessly ahead like a ribbon of black velvet. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:33 p.m. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized I'd been driving for over an hour, but had seen no signs of civilization. No houses, no streetlights, not even another car. Just endless trees and that suffocating darkness. The first sign of something wrong came as a shadow darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. My heart raced as I scanned the road ahead, but there was nothing, just the faint mist rolling in from the trees. I shook my head, convincing myself it was a deer or some other animal. But as I started driving again, the unease grew. The shadow wasn't random. It had been deliberate, purposeful, and worse, I could feel it. Not see it, but sense it, like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, like a child giggling somewhere far off. I turned down the radio, straining to hear. The laughter grew louder, more distinct, and then it stopped, abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. My chest tightened as I realized it hadn't been coming from outside. It had been inside the car. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, but the words felt hollow. The laughter didn't return, but the air inside the car was colder now, so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs. I tried to focus on the road, but something was wrong. The landmarks, sharp bends, a lone mile marker, a rock formation shaped like a hand, were repeating. I'd been here before. It was as if I was driving in circles, trapped in an endless loop. Panic set in. I checked my phone for GPS, but there was no signal. The battery, which had been at 60% when I started, now showed a flashing red 1%. It died seconds later, plunging me back into isolation. As I rounded a bend, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart jumped into my throat. I hit the brakes again, but this time the car swerved, skidding to a stop mere feet from the figure. It was a woman, dressed in a white gown that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her face was obscured by her long black hair, and her arms hung limply at her sides. I honked the horn, but she didn't move. I rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She lifted her head, and I wished I hadn't asked. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow voids of darkness. She opened her mouth, and an inhuman wail erupted, a sound that tore through me like a knife. I slammed the car into reverse, but before I could move, She disappeared, gone, as if she'd never been there. Shaking, I drove on, my hands trembling on the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. She was in the back seat. Her hollow eyes stared at me through the mirror, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. My heart raced as I swerved, nearly losing control of the car. "Get out!" I screamed, but she didn't move. The car's radio crackled to life by blaring static. Through the noise, I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. My vision blurred, and I struggled to keep the car on the road. I muttered prayers under my breath, desperate for some kind of salvation. The figure in the back seat began to fade, her smile the last thing to disappear. But the cold remained, and with it, the whispers. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw a light ahead, a flickering neon sign. An old rundown gas station emerged from the darkness, its windows boarded up, the pump. The crunch of gravel under my feet, the only sound. The air smelled of rust and decay. Inside, the station was a time capsule of the 1970s. Faded posters clung to the walls, and an old cash register sat covered in dust. But what caught my attention was the newspaper lying on the counter. The headline read, "Car found abandoned on Ridge Pass. Driver missing." My blood turned to ice as I read the date. It was today's date. A noise behind me made me spin around. The woman in white stood in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You can't leave," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You belong here now." I bolted for the car, but the engine wouldn't start. She appeared in front of the windshield, her face contorted in rage. The glass cracked under her gaze, and I screamed as the world went black. The endless loop. I woke up in my car. The engine idling. The clock on the dashboard reading 11:00 p.m. I was back at the start of Ridge Pass, the road stretching endlessly ahead. My phone buzzed with a notification, and for a brief moment, I felt hope. But when I looked, the screen displayed a single message: "You'll never leave." And so, I drove, trapped in an endless loop, the shadows of Ridge Pass my only companions.